Hello. Hi. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for being so flexible about the timing. For those of you who are going to be here in July, thank you for being here in October. This is a book that we knew at Lighthouse was going to be really exciting the first moment we heard about it. We knew from the list of contributors that this was a sort of landmark book in this particular moment, and it was doing something really refreshing in terms of the breadth of issues that it was covering. This is a book that goes from climate justice to public ownership, education to migration, and in the case of two of the contributors tonight, fair work, and of course, for a new Scotland, and Scotland's constitutional conundrums, I think you called them in this chapter. So to take us through this extraordinary book, I'm actually going to hand over mostly to Gregor Gall, who is the editor, and then we're going to hear a little bit from Ruth. We're hopefully going to hear from Pamela, who will surely arrive in good time, and then we're going to finish off with Michael Keating, and then there will be lots of time for questions from you. I have a few I will bounce out, but that's kind of it for me. Welcome to everyone who's online. There is a chat box on the website, so if you have questions, then do feel free. Is this Pamela? Come on through. Hello, Linda. Sorry. Yeah. Come on through. We've got a stall for you. There we go. Sorry, Linda. A great last minute addition. We weren't sure we were going to have Gregor, so we've ended up with an all-star panel. So without further ado, will you please join me all in giving them all a very warm welcome.
Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. As Mary said, thanks for coming a bit later. That was due to me. I wasn't sure I would get here on time, so I'm glad that I am. I'm glad that you're here. But we just introduce the speakers tonight. We have Ruth Hughes, who is Professor of Labour Law at the University of Glasgow. She and her co-authors wrote about the issue of fair work in Scotland. Next, we will have Linda Somerville, who previously was the Director of the National Union of Students Scotland, but is now one of the Deputy General Secretaries at the Scottish Trade Union Congress. And Linda, along with some other colleagues, including Lynn Henderson and Willie Sullivan, they wrote a chapter on how to campaign for progressive change in the communities. And our final speaker will be Professor Michael Keating, who has held posts at both Edinburgh and Aberdeen universities and has written about constitutional change and constitutional politics. So my job really tonight is just to explain the rationale for why the book came about and what it's trying to do, and hopefully what kind of thoughts and discussion and debate it will stimulate. If I could just say at the outset, the book is the product, if you like, of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, which was set up in 2011. Jimmy Reid, you may know, was probably one of Scotland's leading trade unionists. He was the leader of the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders Working, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of its successful conclusion this month. He set up the magazine called the Scottish Left Review. And the Scottish Left Review, when Jimmy Reid died in 2010, a year later, it set up the foundation in his name. And both Ruth and Linda both sit on the project board of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, and they were part of the process by which the book was created and has come to fruition. And of course, as I say, they contributed as well. So why did we decide to create this book, and why did we attempt to draw on so many different contributors to the book? Well, the first thing to say was that when we started thinking about the book, it was pretty much 20 years after the creation of the Scottish Parliament. So we're talking about 2019, then of course we go into the pandemic. And a lot of us were feeling that that anniversary was significant in as much as many of the hopes and aspirations of those that had campaigned for the Parliament to come into creation or come back after 300 years, many of those hopes and aspirations have not been realised. Scotland was still scarred by social inequality, by poverty, by hugely different mortality rates amongst rich and poor in certain areas of Glasgow and certain areas of Edinburgh. So we thought that it was worth exploring what the Scottish Parliament and what the devolved settlement had been able to do, as well as what it hadn't been able to do, and then start to look for the reasons as to why that outcome had come about. Back in the early 1970s, when the Scottish Trade Union Congress, the STUC, was one of the first bodies to campaign for Home Rule, as it was then called, Jimmy Jacks, who was the General Secretary of the STUC at the time, said that the STUC wanted to campaign for a workers' parliament, a parliament that would represent, defend and advance workers' interests. And I think to anybody, it's fairly clear that the parliament has not been of that nature. In the book, we use the term professional managerial class. And I think it's a fair comment to say that much of the inner workings of the parliament, the external lobbying of the parliament, as well as the way that the parties organise themselves, which wasn't supposed to be like Westminster, has now ended up being a situation where there's been a political capture of many of those committees and processes, and we do not have the radical outcomes that many of us would have expected. In the book, it's not a book that is in favour of independence. It's not a book that's in favour of enhanced devolution or further devolution. There are many, many different opinions and views in the book. And I thought that was important. We, as the Jimmy Reid Foundation, thought it was important to bring all those things together, because we do want to have a conversation with those that don't want to see independence but do want to see further change. We also, of course, want to have a conversation with those that do favour independence. I think one of the key things that the book outlines is that whatever constitutional option people favour, it's not enough in itself just to think about the Constitution. If you think, for example, about independence, there are probably 4 different types of independence we could have. And I'm just talking about the kind of political outcomes, not the external relations. We could have a neoliberal Scotland. We could have social liberal Scotland. We could have a social democratic Scotland. And we could have a socialist Scotland, probably the last one being the most furthest away. But that just highlights the fact that independence in and of itself doesn't deliver particular political outcomes. We have to be much more careful about what we're thinking about and arguing for. And of course, as many people in the book do point out, political choices in the Parliament have already been made such that many of the existing powers of the Parliament are not used, particularly in regard of taxation. And now that they are coming into being used, that is, yes, there was the extension of the devolution settlement to the Second Scotland Act, but it's very much late in the day. So the book is premised on those kind of ideas. Just let me wind my notes down a little bit. In the book itself, there's 3 sections. The first is the kind of scene-setting macro sections about economics, about neoliberalism, about the environment. And then the middle section is about different areas, whether it's work and employment, transport, energy, health, education. There's 24 chapters in all. And in those middle chapters, what we asked the authors to do is to say what's wrong with the current situation, identify what the problems are, say why they think that situation has arisen. And there was no steer given to them other than the fact that they're all on the left and they would have their own views on this. Then go on to say what they think the progressive, radical alternatives to the current situation are, and then think about how they might come about. Because I think one of the problems of the left is that it's great about, well, you might not think it's great, I happen to think it's great in this respect, it's great about having ideas about what we should do, but it always is a lot weaker in my view on how you bring them about, how you actually go about operationalising them. So we did ask in the book that the contributors to the chapters attempt to do that. So I think that the book covers almost everything that's conceivable in terms of what we would need to see as the different components of a progressive society, economy and polity in Scotland. There's one exception, and it's only because we couldn't get a chapter on external relations. You may recall that it's often been said that Scotland is or could be a progressive beacon for other countries in the world. That's the only omission in the book. But I think everything pretty much else is there. And let me just finish with a few extra comments before I hand over to Ruth. One of the things that the introduction says in the book is that the way that we use the term social justice in Scotland is increasingly becoming devoid of any real valuable meaning. It's used by pretty much all the parties, including sometimes the Tories. And clearly there must be differences in the way that they use it, but those don't really come through in terms of the political discourse that we are aware of when we watch the BBC or read the Herald. So one of the tasks of the left, which I think we do put some flesh on the bones, as it were, is to say what does social justice look like? It's got to be more than nice words. And in order to do that, one of the things that we have to do is be clear about what is and isn't social democracy. Both the SNP and Scottish Labour, and probably the Greens, although they don't quite use the term the same way, talk about them being social democratic parties. And in a nutshell, if you're a social democrat, particularly if you're in government, so you're the government, the political party in office, the government, social democracy is about intervening in the processes and outcomes of the market. So that means that the free market is no longer completely free. You regulate capital, you regulate capitalism, and the outcomes would flow from that. And one of the ways that you can do that, of course, is to redistribute wealth. But I make the argument in the introduction that we need to go, as it were, deeper than that. And we need to talk about pre-distribution. Pre-distribution would be more about sorting out the problems before they actually arise. So you would regulate employers and capital in a way that stops those unfavourable outcomes happening in the first place. So on that basis, I think we do have to question the claim that both the SNP and Scottish Labour are social democratic. Labour back in the day used to be, but isn't now. I don't think the SNP could be characterised as social democratic in the past. It may be in the future, we wait and see. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Ruth Jukes.
Thanks, David. Thank you all for being here. My chapter is called Decent Work in Scotland, a Charter for Change. And I wrote the chapter together with Jane Carolan, who had leadership positions in the trade union Unison for 30 years or so, and with Eleanor Kirk, who is a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, who is expert in labour law and industrial relations. Jane and Eleanor and I drew on work that we've done together and with others on a Charter of Workers' Rights for Scotland. And in the chapter, we talk about, as Gregor said, we talk about why we think there was a need for such a charter, and then we talk a little bit about what the charter, the objectives of the charter, and its what it sets out to do. So I should explain before I go any further that employment law, including trade union law and employment rights, so rights to minimum wage, sick pay, holiday pay, etc., all of that is what we call a reserved matter in the Constitution, meaning that these are matters for Westminster only, and the Scottish Parliament is unable to legislate directly to improve workers' rights. That said, the Scottish Government and local government in Scotland are far from powerless in this respect, as I'll go on to explain. Working with the Institute of Employment Rights, which is our think tank for the labour movement, Jane, Eleanor, I and others, we drafted this Charter of Workers' Rights for Scotland, which has two aims. First of all, the Charter proposes a set of rights for workers and trade unions in Scotland. And secondly, it identifies the steps that could be taken now under the current constitutional settlement in Holyrood and by local authorities to promote and implement these rights, notwithstanding the fact that employment law is a reserved matter. Why did we see a need for a charter like this, a Charter of Workers' Rights for Scotland? It was estimated in 2020 that more than a third of Scottish workers are in bad jobs. And by bad jobs, I mean jobs that are insecure, they don't deliver any security for the worker, and they do not provide the worker with a decent standard of living. Many workers in Scotland are on 0 hours contracts, and there are pernicious inequalities between groups of workers. So women workers do worse than male workers, Black and ethnic minority workers do worse, young workers do worse than others. The reasons for all of that are complex, but one very important part of the picture, at least an important part of the picture, is the nature of employment law in this country and the very weakened state of our trade unions. Unions exist to defend their members' interests. Membership is voluntary and union decision-making is democratic. Workers, as individuals, tend to have no or very little power relative to their employers. Trade unions can seek to rebalance this workplace equation by requiring employers to negotiate with them, with the workforce as a whole, rather than with the powerless individuals. They can also ensure that workers' rights are respected by employers, especially where the union has a presence in the workplace. And as I'm sure you all know, the unions became greatly weakened in this country from the 80s and 90s on, again for complex reasons, but again an important part of the picture, I would argue, is legal change and the use of legal change by the Conservatives directly to the unions. That was a policy objective. Without trade unions today, so many workplaces are now without trade unions, the majority. Without trade unions and without collective bargaining, a take it or leave it system has developed, in which workers have very little choice but to accept whatever wages and other terms and conditions the employer offers. There are individual statutory rights, individual employment rights in this country. I mentioned the right to a minimum wage, paid holidays, sick pay, maternity pay, and so on. However, these are often very difficult for individual workers to enforce if the employer doesn't kind of voluntarily comply with them. They can also relatively easily be contracted out of by an employer in this country. An employer can use a contract between itself and the worker to designate the worker as something other than an employee. And if the worker isn't an employee because they're a casual worker or a 0 hours worker or an agency worker, then they don't have the whole suite of employment rights in the first place. Trade union law is extremely restrictive in this country, and it looks set to get more so under the current government, various plans being mentioned. I saw reported in the newspapers, I think yesterday, well, you've probably all seen it. First of all, a suggestion that in small businesses, which have been redefined to include all businesses with 500 workers or employees or less, there will be no employment rights. And for any worker earning £55,000 or more, there will be no employment rights. This is kind of at the stage slightly of rumour, but it's been reported in the Financial Times. And these are some of the ideas that the government is floating, maybe amongst themselves for the moment. So things are set to get worse in Westminster, and rather than waiting for a Labour government to be elected and to save us all, the idea behind the Charter, as I said, was to think about what could be done in Scotland now. Even if there's a Tory government in Westminster, what could be done then? So the Charter aims to replace this take it or leave it system that we have today with something much better. It proposes a new system in which workers are both protected from ill and unfair treatment, and at the same time, importantly, empowered to participate in setting their own wages and terms and conditions. So it's not just a benevolent government acting to ensure that there's fair treatment. Workers are involved themselves, back to social democracy that Gregor was talking about. Specifically, the Charter proposes worker rights to be paid a living wage, to have transparent and predictable working hours, to be paid an increased overtime rate when working on after the shift has ended, etc. Rights that we all know from maybe from the past, from international law, from the law of other countries. There's also a section of the Charter on equality, and there's a section on collective rights and collective bargaining. Strong unions and collective bargaining improve democracy, they help to achieve social justice, and they help to ensure respect for the rule of law and for international standards that the UK is bound by. It's not enough for the government to guarantee workers' rights to form and join unions. The government must also take positive steps to promote union recognition and collective bargaining within workplaces and employing organisations. So a final few words on what the government could do, what the Scottish Government, what local government could do today. First of all, it could lead by example. The government employs a lot of people, so it could ensure that those employees, government employees, are all being treated well. It could encourage union recognition and collective bargaining in the public sector. It could create a dedicated department within the Scottish Government and with a cabinet level minister responsible for labour matters. It could do more to consult trade unions and employers associations on relevant matters. Lastly, it could use its wide-ranging administrative powers to encourage private sector employers to treat workers well and to recognise unions. Specifically, the powers that it has when it comes to contracting for goods and services with the private sector, and licensing. So, for example, hotels, so on, certain businesses have to be licensed, and licenses could be made conditional on things like respect for workers' rights and union recognition. Okay, I feel like I've spoken enough. Last thing to mention is a key focus of the Charter is on government promotion of collective bargaining, and especially on sectoral collective bargaining. So collective agreements that cover a whole sector, and you would be looking at prioritising sectors where employment relations are particularly precarious and pay is particularly low, like the care sector, construction, and so on. It's difficult to exaggerate either the scale of the need for a programme to strengthen our employment laws and revitalise collective bargaining, or the importance of the Scottish Government's role in making this happen. International evidence clearly demonstrates that collective bargaining can raise wages and enhance worker protections. It's also associated with other benefits such as closing the gender pay gap, enhancing worker voice and job security, eliminating private competition for public services on low wages alone, and preventing the exploitation of agency workers. As debates on constitutional matters continue, the Institute of Employment Rights with this Charter has begun the important work of demonstrating that where there is political will, there is certainly a way.
Thanks very much, Ruth. And I think it's interesting to reflect on some of the policy developments that you've just outlined there. Scottish Government to try to take some of these forward. The Fair Work Convention is also doing parts of it, but that joined up approach just doesn't actually exist. And there's lots of legal challenges around what they think is the procurement limitations, but I think that's one to explore. Thanks very much, Gregor, for inviting me along this evening. And I think what I wanted to kind of focus my remarks on is moving on from some of the policy development that's in the book. When we think about some of the visions that were put out there, and there are chapters, as Gregor says, of all kinds of areas of basically what we would want to see, whether it's through education, health, transport, lots of different policy areas and lots of good visions within that. But when we think about it, regardless of what the constitutional settlement is in Scotland, we have to actually make these things a reality. And I completely agree with Gregor that all too often people write about, there's lots of, particularly when it's the referendum in Scotland, there's lots of blue sky thinking about what could be done, but not any ways to actually implement that or indeed evaluate lots of it. So I think the authors of the book really throughout it, there's lots of people in the book who would agree that only to make significant change, we're not going to get that through lobbying government, and we're not going to get that sometimes through just policy development. And there has to be other methods to kind of look at. So the chapter that I was involved in, along with the other co-authors, we looked at really a few issues around how we could actually make change and what does that look like, about the failure of some of the institutions that there are around the state. We then also went on to look at, why those institutions don't deliver for citizens anymore in a way that they potentially did at one point, where there was much more of a social contract in the UK and in Scotland. What opportunities that either trade unions or community campaigns have to actually make change. And then also think about methods of participation and engagement. What does that look like? How can people be involved in decision making about the things that are very important to them? But underneath that, there was kind of underlying themes throughout the chapter to do with a lack of trust in institutions, a lack of agency for those that are, whether it's at work, in the workplace, or in communities, and also kind of an exploration, a very initial exploration of what the alternative methods might be of participation in democracy, engagement in democracy, and also in campaigning methods which might feel quite fresh and new. Some of them are actually reinvented from a long time ago, but in terms of using organising as a tool, rather than just lobbying or indeed mobilising. I'll say a bit more about that. I mean, in terms of the political parties and the institutions in Scotland, I mean, when the Scottish Parliament was created, we were promised all kinds of ways to for it to deliver change in Scotland. And I think there are very significant things in the Scottish Parliament in terms of its processes, which we should still welcome today, whether it's access to the Parliament, access to politicians, cross-party groups on special subjects. There are things that just wouldn't happen in Westminster, which has, you know, layers of both physical barriers and actual real barriers in terms of access for you to get to speak to politicians and to try and make any kind of change. But the SNP, since it's had its governance in Scotland, has been so solid across the country, and obviously the polarisation over the vote in Scotland over independence means that they now don't actually have to make much effort to change any of the system. It suits them for it to stay as it is. They can manage to get by on a minority rule with working either with formally or informally with the Green Party, or potentially even others which could be looked at. So their idea of trying to change democratic practice is very unlikely. There's no point for them to do it. And they've also been very successful also in Scotland, the SNP, of bringing in civic society into their own fold through a whole series of stakeholder engagement methods, which really lead to the management of the stakeholders. And that's up into a funding model as well. You'll find that a lot of people in Civic Scotland are actually funded through the government. So it kind of neuters potentially some of their opinion or some of the way that they think that they can then radically ask for change. Not always. There are examples where that doesn't happen, but there's a lot of that happens as well. So the fact that people look for public funding actually sometimes neuters what they can then do in terms of development beyond that. And as Gregor said, the book does talk about the professional managerial class, which kind of grows out of that kind of scene as well. In Scotland, for those that have lived in at the time, you'll know it's a very small place. You don't have to go very far to, you know, meet someone else that you know. And the same is very much true in the circles around politicians. There's a recycling of politicians and political staff through the kind of parliament and then into civic society and back again. And so that, you know, that goes round and round. I think the efforts that there have been to try and make lobbying more transparent in Scotland have been helpful, but it's still not really, it's kind of targeted in the wrong place. I think it's targeted towards civic society rather than big business, which is probably where we want to see that transparency. And beyond that, I mean, what we tried to do in the book after we looked at the failure of kind of the states when we think about the breakdown in trust that there's been with political parties, and also the press, misinformation, disinformation, how we've seen that used both in Brexit and also in the independence referendum and other examples. We felt that we had got to a situation where people have lost a lot of trust into their main institutions, which they might have had, and people no longer are waiting for a political party to come and save them in the way that they might have. So the other options that we looked at were what kind of power do trade unions have and what power do communities potentially have to organise and to make change and to take forward some of those very those policy developments that we've outlined to make them actually practical. So trade unions and the examples that were given in the book are often areas where you've seen trade union growth despite the downward trend there's been for a long time, and also around where there has been, particularly since the book was written, a lot of industrial disputes. But even at the time the book was written, there were some very notable industrial disputes in Scotland that we could mention. And the ones that there were, whether it was Unison and the Equal Pay Strike, predominantly in Glasgow, or whether you looked at the teacher strike across the whole of Scotland, those unions had adopted forms of organising as a model and an approach which was different to what they might have used before in their other campaigning methods. And organising has a variety of flavours about it, but it moves away from individualising both what happens in the workplace and your response to what happens in the workplace. And it also moves away from what was a very dominant theme within trade unions of servicing, where trade unions had individual members and you joined because you needed a service from that trade union. And it moves back to a much more collective approach of organising. And the methods are slightly different depending on what model they use, but it has results. And those results can be seen very clearly by the success there was in equal pay claims, and indeed the teachers who a few years ago got a 10% pay rise. And at that point, that was way above what anyone would have expected. Organising is really resource heavy. Trade unions have to have quite a lot of funding to do it. And so there's different methods of doing it. One of the other trade unions that's been actively involved in this, but doesn't always get as much attention, is Unite the Union, because they are in the public sector, but a lot of the work they do is in the private sector. And Unite tend to use a campaign around organising, but also around leverage, where they look at what are the things around this employer which we know that we can actually put some pressure on. An example of that a number of years ago was Unite decided that they wanted to try and unionise in a completely non-unionised sector, and that was those factory workers working in meat production. Often they would have been migrant workers as well. And when they tried to do that, they found that as well as trying to recruit and to organise within the actual production, that they tried to look at how else can we influence these employers. Because what the employers were likely to do is actually just get rid of that workforce and another workforce of people unionised. So what they tried to do was say, well, who's buying this product? Where can we work up the supply chain? Which are the large brands that are buying these products of potentially white meat factories? And they looked at them, the big supermarkets, which they knew weren't ethical, probably didn't want much to do with them. So what they chose was a much smaller consumer of the product, which was actually Marks and Spencer's, which had a much more brand awareness in terms of its ethical nature. And therefore they targeted Marks and Spencer's to say that they put pressure on them to finally them to agree that they would only buy their product from a trade union recognised workplace, and therefore that lined up eventually the supermarkets to follow suit. So that kind of leverage campaign is part of the organising approach that some of the unions have taken. And so we really begin to scratch the surface in that in the chapter, looking at what we do about organising. The flip side of that is about community organising, where people in communities are faced across Scotland daily with either loss of services, closure of schools, demolition of buildings, or the creation of developments that they don't want in their communities, and how people have begun to organise around those things. And sometimes that can be through lobbying, through influencing local authorities and the local councils, but sometimes it needs a lot more than that, especially if you're dealing with the private sector who may be trying to develop or indeed build in your area. So there's a variety of examples we've seen across Scotland where people have come together and again sometimes used organising methods to talk about, rather than just mobilising large numbers, but how do we get those deep-rooted actual connections between people where the relationships are built and they can come back time and time again, rather than just coming to a demonstration then going home and that's the end of it. So there's been different methods and a lot of success has actually come out of that. I think some of the things about community organising as well, and what it reflects back to the trust with your elected representatives. Local democracy for most people looks like voting once every 5 years. And really what you give someone is your vote in return for a set of promises. And for most people, that's as far as it goes. That after that, these people will then set budgets for the next 5 years. They will make key decisions for the next 5 years that will affect everything around how you get to work, if you work, where you work, your housing, your conditions, all around in the local area. And yet there is no recourse. There is very little accountability or ongoing engagement with people. The Scottish Government has brought out a few examples where they tried to look at this. Democracy Matters was a big bit of consultation work they were doing about levels of democracy, not at local authority level, but just below that, the community councils, and looking at maybe what they could do there. They've made a few tentative approaches to look at things like citizens' assemblies, and they've run a couple of them, and they're doing a couple now. But they've not taken it on in such a predominant way and such embraced it in the same way potentially as Ireland, where it has resulted in some real change to civic engagement and some big shifts in policy there that people 20 years ago would never have thought was possible. So there are other methods that can be looked at, but I think for community organising, I think what people have found is that if you look to the structures that are already there, you'll find that they're probably not that useful to you because they exist to continue to perpetuate those that are already elected and those elites that potentially need them to stay in those positions. So people will find new forms of organising and new ways to actually take that democracy forward. Just finally, I wanted to say a little bit about some of the other things that have happened probably since the book was published, but I think are also relevant when we think about organisations, organising, and how we begin to make change across Scotland. Just in a matter of weeks, we have seen new groups spring up, like Power to the People, who are looking at how they can actually demand changes to the energy pricing structures in Scotland, and demanding that not from the government, but actually from businesses. How can we begin to put pressure on the corporates? We've seen as Enough is Enough, which is a new UK organisation, which also has groups across Scotland demanding some 5 key changes to both wealth redistribution, housing and wages across the UK. And we've seen other groups such as Don't Pay UK, which are looking to say that let's actually not pay our electricity bills, our gas bills, and see where we end up. So these new groups are actually beginning to look at what methods that they've got for organising, and some of them will be there'll be movement builders very, very quickly, and then they'll have a whirlwind moment, and then they'll be gone again. But some will actually stay depending on the method of organising that they use. And I think Power to the People is probably in a position where it's a better place to do that at the moment than others. But it'd be nice to reflect on that in a year or so's time and see what's come out of those groups. But they show that people, when they do come together, we can collectively make change. We can't wait on the institutions or those in civic society. Some of the groupings that are there to do representation don't always deliver for people. And we really do need to look at new methods if we're actually going to try and deliver some of the things that we want in Scotland.
Thanks for everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come along. I'm not going to talk about the Constitution because that's in legal sense about laws and I'm going to pick up some of the things that Gregor was talking about earlier on, which is about what kind of society we want and how we get there, and then what institutions might flow from that. And in the years when I was directing the Centre on Constitutional Change in Edinburgh, that's what we're trying to do. We have legal scholars, we talked about Constitution, we talked about independence and Zero Max and independence life and the whole gamut of things, but all in relation to what governments do, what governments can do, how governments can make society better, working with society, of course, as well. So we're profoundly interested in what governments do. We're interested in democracy, what democracy means. We're interested in accountability. Otherwise, talking about constitutions is utterly meaningless. So, look at the current constitutional debate, and that is the big issue in Scottish politics these days. And all the surveys we've done show us that's how people vote. They're for independence or anti-independence. It's nothing to do with right or left anymore. That's completely not. But if you look at the two sides, on the one hand, we have the unionists who say, well, you need to have the union for social solidarity, for the welfare state, for the NHS, to have a big market, and so on. Social solidarity operates in multiple levels, all the way from the neighbourhood up to the world level. It doesn't just operate on the basis of the UK. And if you look at the way the UK government is going right now, then it's pretty rather difficult to say that that is anything to do with social solidarity. So it's a curious time, but that's where the Labour Party is hooked. Well, we need the union for social solidarity, for welfare, for social democracy. So the UK is just one level. It's just one set of institutions that may or may not work. But if you look at the other side, the SNP and the nationalist side, particularly let's talk about the SNP, they say, well, we just need to become independent and we're a small state. And then they get these tables of small states showing how being a small state means that you'll be more socially inclusive, you'll grow faster, the sun will shine every day of the year just by being a small state. It's another really strange argument because you've got to make the connection between these two kinds of things. So we tried to explore this, and around the time of the independence referendum, in fact it was in 2014 with my colleague Malcolm Harvey, I published a book out with a project called Small Nations in a Big World, What Scotland Can Learn. And I'm not pushing this book, I'm not talking it. It sold out both editions years ago, and they lost the third edition. But anyway, it was an interesting argument, and saying, well, look, let's look at this small state argument, and whether these are small independent states or small self-governing nations like Quebec or France, the rest of those places. And how do they do? And of course, there's a huge range of experiences. But just to simplify, because it's easy to get an argument over if you simplify the argument and say, look, there's two kinds of models. One is let's say, the premise of this is if you're a small state and a small nation, you don't control your external environment. You can't. Even big countries can't do that. Even the United States can't do that. They try. And certainly the UK can't, because they're not a country. But in any case, if you're a small state, you certainly can't. So what you do about the global capital flows and the global movements of people, which are unstoppable. It's futile to imagine you can suddenly stop movements of people. trade and investment and so on. You can either just roll with the tide, or you can try and adapt to conditions and try and manage your adaptation to this world. So the former would be the market liberal model. We could call it the neoliberal model, but that term isn't so stretched. The market liberal model, which Greg was talking about earlier on, cut your taxes, small states, deregulate, allow free immigration in and out, by the way, that's part of the some people call this, the neoliberals like to call it the Singapore model, but everybody I know is everybody in Singapore. It's not actually like that in Singapore. But anyway, that's, Singapore is just a slogan for this nirvana out there. It's a wonderful place where the market actually works. And you can do it. And we look at the Baltic states, that's what they do. They have massive economic cycles of unemployment, boom and bust. We live with it. And when you're in a bust time, people leave. And in boom times, people come in. It's way of organizing your economy. I'm a social democrat. I don't like that model, but you know, if you want it there, it's available. And the other is the social investment model, the so-called Nordic model, but Nordic countries are really very, very different. But this is a different model in which you can deal with global markets and globalization by having a highly regulated state, by having high regulations, by having high tax levels and good public services, because public services are not, as some people say, drain on the public purse. They're actually investment, because without health and without education and without research and infrastructure, you can't have the economy grow. Somebody should tell Kwasi. It doesn't work. You need investment. And so that model is a high cost model. It puts a premium on social solidarity and cohesion. And it adapts not through the market, but through measures of social regulation and social cooperation in order to be able to confront the big beast out there, globalization, as we used to call it, but forces that otherwise you can't control. Now, there are some countries that try and mix the two. Ireland is a bit like that. It doesn't really work. I know Ireland has a GDP vastly greater than Scotland. And when I was growing up, it was a fraction of Scotland's GDP. But there's massive social equality. It's not a students don't find terribly attractive. And the SNP, if you look at their prospectus, they say, well, we'll have a little bit of Denmark and a little bit of New Zealand and a little bit of that and the other thing. But you can't pick and choose these bits, because these are models that go together and require sustained investment, sustained long-term strategic thinking, the kind of regulation, things that the labour markets, Linda was talking about, how you make policy, how you have more inclusive models of policy making. You don't get that just by becoming an independent state. You do it by internal change in the way you organize society. And once you get to that point, then the question of whether you're independent or not becomes really a bit of an abstract question. The question is what institutions and powers you have, how can you use them? They just had an election in Quebec yesterday. It was run again by particularly backward-looking reaction of the government. But until that government came in, Quebec had quite a distinct social model within Canada. They had higher welfare payments, they had more inclusive arrangements, they had a pioneer childcare system, they paid more taxes, and it worked within the Canadian Federation. You don't actually need to become independent to do that. So in the case of Scotland, well, if we're going to become independent, we need to decide what more we want. We can't just be sold a mix of the two. And the SNP don't want to go there because they don't want to scare anybody. They're a catch-all party. But short of independence, what could we do? Well, think about what kind of powers we have and what powers we eventually gain. Now, the powers that we've got in Scotland, we know how we got there, because first of all, they were all the powers that the Scottish Office had. That was it. And then there was a Calman Commission in which they went around all the Westminster departments and said, you've got to devolve some powers to Scotland. They said, no, you've got to give us something. So you got air rifles, speed limits. And then we got the Smith Commission, which was just bargaining amongst the parties. And so the Conservatives actually at that time said, yeah, we want tax devolution because they wanted to put pressure on us. The Labour Party said we don't want that. So you got the income tax. It's not all of income tax. You had a messy compromise, and you got a little bit of welfare. And that was a missed opportunity for us. Even within the devolution settlement, one could imagine a different balance of powers that would allow us to have a distinct in Scotland, just as they have traditionally in Quebec. At the moment, we've got a welfare system that is at the same time economically extremely efficient. It's highly punitive, and it has a lousy job. There's a lousy job in ensuring social equity. It's just the worst of all systems you can imagine. Scotland could do something different if you took the tax powers together, progressivity in taxing, welfare, incentives for people, labour market policy to ensure proper labour standards. So things that you do there without being independent necessarily. That's getting the balance of power. So that's where we are, and it's really quite depressing because we don't see parties who are making those or doing that kind of thinking. Instead of you get little bits of incremental change, or we'll be a bit of we'll have the best of New Zealand and Denmark, and so on. Everything will be right on the day. Instead of doing that, thinking about what trade-offs will be made, how much are we prepared to pay taxes? There's evidence, for example, that societies that actually tax people more and have greater equity are actually more efficient economically. Why don't we look at that kind of argument there? We're just not getting that, and it becomes increasingly frustrating to watch these constitutional debates without those being faced. Lastly, just thinking about what Linda was saying about policy, because obviously in the same sorts of places I've been, it becomes increasingly frustration. The Scottish government has these endless consultations with their people that are sometimes on their own payroll. And you say, yes, things are okay, but maybe just a little bit here and there. And we'll have one table with all the social policy people sitting and agreeing with each other. And the environmentalists are over there. And then the business people are somewhere else and talking. They never talk to each other across these. You will never get business talking to the environmentalists. Okay, let's have a deal here. Because we both got some common interest. So the social being combined with the economic. They're all separate. And I've done studies of policy making in a number of small nations, as I mentioned. I also done studies on European developed nations and regions as well. And why Scotland stands out is the lack of capacity to engage in that kind of dialogue. The lack of capacity to think in an innovative way about policy. To look at the business community, say, okay, we'd like you to invest here, and we'll give you a good deal to invest here, but you've got to give us something in return. That's the deal. Not just we're going to cut taxes and hope that you'll come here. Okay. We don't have that. Now, we'll be able to muddle through for 20 years now without making those decisions, because there was an initial thing that and there was so much money and given what's happening in Westminster, the shenanigans that have gone in the last couple of weeks, it's quite clear that we don't have a choice in Scotland of being status quo. We're being told, look, we're going to cut taxes and deregulate in London. Are you going to follow us or not? If not, then where are you going to get your money from? So the muddling through option is going to become extremely difficult. Scotland's going to have to make a serious choice because we'll be forced to make those choices. I just hope we'll manage to make the right choices and find the right way.
And then we've got a second microphone up afterwards. Gregor, did you want to make? I've got some online questions, and then there's room for some. Do we have a burning question in the room? No, then I will start with two of these. There's a real sense of possibility in the book. Lots of ideas and capacity are there, but where is the political will? Could each of you tell us one way in which you think that political will could be fostered? It's one of the issues that you so who wants to go first?
Yeah, it's political will. It's also political courage as well. And we've had a government in power now for a long, was it 12 years or something? Maybe 15, you forget, don't you? We've never invested any of their political capital in taking risky decisions, and that is just extraordinary. And opposition parties are pretty much the same. It's the same with the London Labour. It's hyper cautious, even with that. What is the fiscal event, which they're not calling a fiscal event anymore. That thing that happened the Friday before last. Keir Starmer says, well, little bits that we learn, little bits that we don't like. Instead of saying, just throw the whole thing out and start somewhere else. That's so awful. Such an opportunity to say, look, we just don't accept the premise of this argument. So we live in an age of political timidity, and partly it's because we have catch-all politics and politicians don't want to. The old class don't work anymore. But just to pick up my last point, I don't think politicians can escape hard choices now, particularly here. They're cutting taxes, the transport from Westminster, either they fall, if they're cutting expenditure, or they'll cut taxes and borrow money and start to say, are you going to cut taxes as well? Or are you going to spend more on public service? That's going to be the choice. And at last, that I hope that some sort of
And yet the question was, where is the political will? And I think that there's none, or very little. There might be in pockets in a few places and parties, or a few individual politicians that have got much greater ideas for making change. And most people go into politics with good ideas for making change, not all, but some many do. But it doesn't always happen. So, I've looked at the agenda for next week's SNP conference in Aberdeen, and some of the things that didn't make it to the agenda for a variety of reasons, and the things that didn't make it to the agenda are the things that might have made a shift, for example, the tax discussion that we're not going to have, So, but because the political parties, as I said earlier, have potentially failed us in lots of ways, then you need to think about what other structures there are. How else can you push politicians to a place? Now, the industrial action that we've seen in Scotland just weeks ago, when there was during the festival in Edinburgh, when the bins were not being collected, resulted in a multi-million-pound deal for council workers across Scotland. So, and that was a political choice, potentially not political will, but that had to be done. And the last thing they wanted was the schools closed. So, there are things that can be done outside of those political structures. So the political will potentially is not really there. It's up to us to galvanise politicians to move them to a different place.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Linda was saying before around organising, using creative methods of industrial action. As strikes and traditional methods of industrial action become more and more difficult for unions to organise lawfully because the legal restrictions are getting tighter and tighter, this kind of leverage, thinking outside the box, targeting suppliers, going down supply chains and so on is really important. So yes, there have been some stunning victories recently. Hopefully we'll see more. There's the possibility potentially of coordinated industrial action between unions, between groups of workers. But let's whisper it, general strike. And all join a union, please, if you're not a union member already.
Thanks. I'll give you my own personal take on the situation. Along with the likes of Linda, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we were members of what became the Scottish Socialist Party. And if I look back on my political activity, that's probably the only bright spot there was in my estimation. It ended up being a complete car crash, as I'm sure you will be aware. And I haven't detected anything on the political horizon, including the arrival of the Greens as a more important political party in Holyrood. I haven't detected anything that is as good or as hopeful as that, notwithstanding what I just said about the car crash. So the question I think is posed there is, and I think the others have just alluded to it, is do we try to, if you like, enter Parliament, have some new political formation, some kind of left formation? Is that an option that is possible under, the list seats which are done under PR? Is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know at the moment. Or do we say that really the political system shouldn't be entered? It's, keep yourself pure, if you like. Don't go into it. Try and put pressure on those that are in Holyrood and the other important institutions in Scotland. Do it from the outside. I think those are the two options that we face. Well, it take a lot longer tonight than we've got time for to try and work out which one is most opportune. But I think we have to think about that. It's not just a case of can we do one or the other. We've got to think about both, how they might relate to each other. And I very much echo the comments about the kind of revival of unions at the moment. But the rub is that unions are generally reactive to things. I think we've got to raise our horizons to more than that and say, we don't just want to stop bad things, such as pay cuts or changing hours. We've got to have a situation where we can actually determine that things are so much better than they are at the moment, so that we should be demanding a 4-day working week for a whole number of reasons. So we actually are not just defending what we've got, but we're actually making advances. And if we do think about those kind of questions, then we are going to have to think much more widely and practice much more widely, not just the kind of things that Ruth and Linda have been talking about in terms of organising, but having some form of political representation, new form of political representation.
Thank you. I think I'll hold on to this one. Is there, yeah, there's one at the back.
Hi, I guess I work in technology and I'm a business founder. And one of the things I've found here is that, particularly in technology, all the business groups are very, well, capitalist and not trying to seek alternative business models, which is something we've done in my company. And aside from internally treating workers right, is there any good groups or things you can do as a business person to try and, push that political agenda, but, also while maintaining kind of, like, I haven't found any groups that, for example, are advocating for different structures, for different business models, for slow growth. And, they all seem to be following London, they all seem to be following Silicon Valley. And I was hoping amongst a more liberal kind of type of person that I would find that in business too, but that's not what I'm seeing. And I mean, I'm kind of new here, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the empowerment that I can have, but also any groups that exist where I can find like peers to try and push for better business, basically.
I don't think we'll need to repeat it because the live stream is right beside you. So do you want to, does anyone want to jump in on that?
I will say something just to note was a question. Did you want to ask a question? No, sorry. I would say that the opportunities at the moment for a more progressive agenda to emerge from business are relatively limited, because when you look at the likes of CBI Scotland, the Engineering Employers Federation, those are the two big kind of business groups in Scotland, well, domestic ones. They generally don't advocate for much that's progressive, but just as importantly, they don't really have much, even if they did, they don't really have much influence over their affiliates or their members. It's quite, within many aspects of society, it's a bit like the STUC in a way. The STUC, it forms policy, but ultimately it can't tell its affiliates what to do. They have to decide what to do. So there are restrictions on what you can do. And also the process has to be gone through consensus, but then mobilisation. So in terms of the business community, there are some groups that are, pro-independence and anti-independence, but on the wider terrain, the wider political terrain, social issues, I suppose really the thing is, why don't you go and set something up, because it's not there at the moment.
I think I'm a former woman in technology. I spent decades working in tech, mainly in large companies though. But I think that some of the models that you're talking about, there are a few, there are some out there, there are probably some other structures. There are a few different organisations have looked at doing workers' cooperatives. It's not very common in Scotland, but there are some. The Scottish Government recently just brought out a whole new programme called the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which was meant to be all about, economic transformation. It's all about entrepreneurs, much more so than you probably want it to be if you're thinking about industrial policy for Scotland and how we actually build some of that base. But again, it's all based on a growth structure. It's all about how we can kind of escalate that in different ways. So yeah, I think the answer is always if you're the right person, then and it sounds like you've already started to set your own companies up. There might be some others out there, but it's not really in Scotland's fabric, that there's a lot of that just now. There's some other organisations I know that are workers' co-ops, and there are other structures, and the government is looking at a piece of work around, it's not called governance, it's got an even more terrible boring name, which I've forgotten, which they are looking at different models of company ownership. But it's a very small piece of work that they've just started.
Yeah, I'd echo both of those sets of comments, because in Scotland you need to have Scottish-owned companies, the big companies. They disappeared from the 1930s onwards and finally went in the 1980s, and we've got multinational corporations here which predominate to an extraordinary degree in the employment market, and that is combined with the way in which in business in this country, in the UK, increasingly in the last 50 years, has never felt the obligation to engage in any kind of social dialogue, because they just get what they want. It's not good for business, don't mind the rest of the country, because it hasn't honed them up. There's a complacency about British business, or the notion with the internationals, they always take the money somewhere else. And that's a peculiarly British thing. So I studied this in other European countries at the sub-state level as well as the state level. And there's usually some kind of business through the Basque country's case I know very well. Very conscious business community there that is Basque, linked into Basque society. And then we did a study of this in Scotland, and then a study across the regions and nations right across, about the importance of place for development. Because any economist, social economist will tell you that place really matters, and even multinationals. Place really matters. These places are not substitutable one for another. They know that. So they want to get in there and exploit the richness of individual places without getting caught up in the local society and politics. And that's the problem, because they should be caught up in the local society and politics and fulfill their social obligation to become part of the society. But they manage to avoid doing that in a way that is very difficult in other countries. But that's just how the British model of capitalism we've had in recent decades. And then finally, what was my final point? Yeah, the structure of a firm in this country too is that Scotland's actually very good at producing new, small, high technology companies. It's very bad at transforming them into middle-sized companies. So it's the minnows, lots of minnows, and some very, very entrepreneurship, really good technology being developed, but it's swallowed up and sold up. Again, that's the British model, rather than becoming a middle-sized companies. And we found in our various studies, those middle-sized parts of companies, because they can't control their own markets, they can't control their own businesses, they have to become more socially embedded because of conditions of survival. But the big companies don't. And I think the failure to develop those small-sized companies explains some of the weakness of this social dialogue in Scotland and why we don't have.
I think we are over time a little bit, but if you've got a very quick one.
Say that there's a network called the Edinburgh Social Enterprise Network, in reply to the woman who was speaking. The social enterprise is another way of organizing business, which makes it not just more community conscious, but more conscious of the of employment rights and everything else. So it's much less based on what you're saying.
And then we had Anne asked a question online a while ago, so I'm conscious of getting it out there. A question for Gregor about, and she's put in air quotes, a new Scotland. Looking at the table of contents, the scope is very impressive and there are lots of eminent contributors, but it also seems like a lot of the usual suspects, perhaps at the expense of new and emerging voices, especially writers of colour or those with experience of migrations. How do we expand who we're platforming in these conversations for a new Scotland?
That's a fair comment. Just I would say that the title wasn't actually my choice. It was Pluto, the publisher, that insisted on that. Because I think Linda alluded to this earlier, and I think we probably all would agree that there are in social science and political science, there are actually very few new ideas, notwithstanding the developments about the destruction of environment. Social democracy, liberalism, neoliberalism, social liberalism, socialism, these are ideas and ideologies that are hundreds of years old, and humankind probably hasn't got the capability to develop anything more than they've got. Not that unless they should. There's one of them. I think it's the bee's knees already. It's begins with S, and it's only one word. In terms of the contributors, yes, there are some new people in there. For example, there's a woman called Niamh McNulty who you would have seen on television a couple of weeks ago. She was a person that was holding a banner that had nothing on it on the High Street, not the Royal Mile, the High Street, demonstrating against the monarchy. She's also an environmental activist involved in Climate Camp Scotland. She was involved in XR, Extinction Rebellion. Her sister, Sinead McNulty, who I did try to get to write in it, but her boss decided to write the chapter. She works with Living Rights. So there are some new voices there, if you like. But on the whole, yes, there are many people that all of us together know of a certain age group, and many of us are academics. And so that's fair criticism, but it's also about capacity. You know, it takes time, and networks have to develop in order for you to know the other people that might be able to contribute. And I would hope that if this book sells well and we can bring out a revised edition in a few years' time, then we will be able to take account of those. And whoever that person asked that question, get in contact and let me know what you can write about.
And I think that does. If you had a question you didn't get a chance to ask, then do stick around, pick up a book. If you had a voucher tonight, then you get £3 off the book, and you can come and get it signed, or just enjoy the space. Thanks again for coming, and will you all join me in giving a final big thank you to Philip?